Good evening, everybody. I am Sarah Husby. I'm the Executive Director for Great Old Broads for Wilderness. We are a national nonprofit based in Durango, Colorado. So it is 5 p.m. Mountain Time here. Thank you for everyone joining us in the different time zones and adapting your schedule to be a part of this great conversation tonight. For those of you who don't know, Great Old Broads for Wilderness is a national grassroots organization that is led by women that engages and inspires activism to preserve and protect wilderness and wildlands. And we do that in 4 different ways. We do that through stewardship, education, advocacy, and fun. Everything we do, we try to incorporate fun. We have an exciting conversation tonight, and that's actually really what this is. It's a conversation on the cooperative management practices on our public lands. And once again, I'm very grateful that you're joining us this evening, and let's get started.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. My name is Katya Speaker. I am one of Broads' grassroots regional coordinators. And I'm going to take a quick moment to read a land acknowledgement for us before handing it back over to our other grassroots regional coordinator, Sally Sharp. Great Old Broads for Wilderness's national office is located in Durango, Colorado. Lands that were occupied by contemporary Hopi and Pueblo peoples, as well as the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Shoshone, Comanche, Kiowa, and Navajo people. We acknowledge that our sustenance and prosperity is derived from these lands, from which Native peoples, who have been caretakers of these lands for hundreds of generations, were forcibly removed. We acknowledge the lives and histories of these Indigenous peoples, along with those of the citizens of more than 200 tribal nations now living in Colorado. And we recognize the heinous injustice of European settlers who exploited and expropriated Indigenous peoples and resources. We know that this land acknowledgement is but a small first step towards reconciling our histories. We commit to learning more about the Indigenous peoples here and across the country, and pledge our time and resources to serve the causes of healing from this history while advancing tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and working for equity and representation at every table where decisions are made about the management of all the lands of this continent, all of which are Native homelands. Sally.
Thank you, Katya. After I give a short introduction, each panelist will introduce themselves. Long before the creation of national parks, monuments, and wildlife refuges, Indigenous people lived and cared for these lands for tens of thousands of years, acquiring an intimate knowledge of plants, animals, and ecosystems. This knowledge passed down through generations could be invaluable to mitigating the worsening climate change and biodiversity crisis. A major step forward for public lands across the nation has been the move toward cooperative management policies between the federal government, tribal nations, and Indigenous groups. Today, we are using Bears Ears National Monument as an example. Our panelists will discuss what tribal cooperative management is, how it is beneficial for public lands and Indigenous people, and how to advocate for cooperative management in land planning and conservation. The format for this webinar is a little different. This isn't a typical panel where there's a moderator and each panelist has a presentation. Today, each panelist will offer up their own question for the group. We are hoping this will lead to a more organic and dynamic discussion. Then we will have a period of Q&A. Please write your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to the participant questions at the end. Now, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and we can get started. Regina?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Regina Lopez White Skunk. I am a member of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. I'm of the Uinta and Winooch bands. I reside in southwestern Colorado at the foothills of the Ute Mountain in the community called Toyac. I formerly served on the tribal council for my tribe, and I also was one of the former co-chairs of the original Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. Today, I currently work for Montezuma Land Conservancy while pursuing my master's in environmental management with Western Colorado University. I also sit on many boards, one being the Council of, what do we call it? The Council of Elders for the Great Old Broads. I sit with a distinguished group who help to guide the overall organization. With that, I'd like to say good evening to everybody and welcome. Am I handing it off to Jake?
I think it's Sharisa next.
Oh, Sharisa.
I can go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharisa Mrs. Z.P. Wilson. I am the co-director of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, and I oversee operations, strategic planning, as well as strategic partnerships. I come to this space with a background in cultural anthropology, and much of my practice has been in both informing organizations and their processes and procedures from a cultural lens. And so that's really how I find myself serving Bears Ears. I've been with the organization almost 5 years now. And so I've been with the coalition since its inception with the Obama era monument. And now we sit on the precipice of really ramping up the Bears Ears Commission underneath the Biden administration. I'm really happy to be here and excited that we get to have this conversation among each other. And yeah, I'll wait to see what conversation unfolds. And with that, I am passing it off to Angelo. Thank you.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Yat A. Angelo Baca Yanishya. I'm Navajo and Hopi. I come from San Juan County, Utah. I am from the Bears Ears area, and I've been doing a lot of my work, both personally and professionally, about the protection of Bears Ears. So I am an advocate as well as a researcher, scholar, filmmaker, and instructor. So I've been doing a lot of work trying to do conservation, environmental education, and nonprofit work. So my roles have included cultural resources coordinator for Utah Diné Bikéyah and a board member for Conservation Lands Foundation. So thank you for having me as part of this panel. I'm really honored to be in coordination and collaboration with you all. So thanks for this time.
Thanks, Angelo. Well, it's a privilege to be on the panel with Regina, Teresa, and Angelo tonight. Good evening to everybody who's joining us. My name is Jake Palma, and I am the field manager of the Monticello Field Office for the Bureau of Land Management here in Southeast Utah. And the Monticello Field Office includes Bears Ears National Monument. So as a field office, we manage about 1.8 million acres here in Southeast Utah. And BLM land, about 1.1 million of that is Bears Ears National Monument, with a little bit more being on the Forest Service side. The Forest Service manages the rest of the monument there. But my background, I have family roots in coming from on my mom's side in Eastern Oregon, small rural town in Eastern Oregon, and then my dad's side from Central Mexico and the state of Guanajuato, and came to the BLM about seven years ago, and really interested in finding ways to bring underrepresented communities and their voices into public land management. And that's what I studied in school for my master's program, and partially is what drew me to Bears Ears National Monument about 3.5 years ago, when I came to Monticello, Utah, to be the manager here at Bears Ears. But today I wanted to give just start the conversation off with a little bit of background related to Bears Ears National Monument. There's a long history, obviously, of of this area. And Bears Ears was originally designated as a national monument back in 2016 December by President Obama. There's a long story behind that, and many years and a lot of effort to get to that point of designation in 2016, and then to get to where we're at today with the restored boundaries of Bears Ears National Monument last year in October of 2021. And one of the things that the Presidential Proclamation 10285, which was signed by President Biden last October, it created what is the Bears Ears Commission, or it just reestablished that based on the original proclamation back in 2016. And really the Bears Ears Commission, it was established to ensure that management of the monument would be guided by and benefit from the expertise of tribal nations and traditional and historical knowledge of the area. And to quote the proclamation, restoring the Bears Ears National Monument honors the special relationship between the federal government and tribal nations, correcting the exclusion of lands and resources profoundly sacred to tribal nations, and ensuring long-term protection of and respect for this remarkable revered region. And so, the proclamation, all the proclamations are clear that the BLM and Forest Service will manage the monument, but the agencies, our purpose is to implement the purposes of this proclamation, which is to protect the objects that are identified in there, and then, engage with, one entity is the Bears Ears Commission. And so a couple of points to highlight here is, the proclamation says create a new management plan for the monument. And to do that, it also says that we will work with the newly created Bears Ears Commission, which is a self-organized and governed entity of 5 tribal nations specifically identified in the proclamations. And according to the proclamation, one of the purposes of the Bears Ears Commission is to effectively partner with the federal agencies by making continuing contributions to inform decisions regarding the management of the monument. And as a result of the proclamation, the agencies and the 5 tribal nations signed a cooperative agreement in June of this year of how we're going to work together to be able to cooperatively manage this landscape. And so this cooperative agreement that was signed, which creates this relationship between the federal agencies and tribal nations, it starts with a recognition that the agencies are responsible for managing federal lands within the monument, but that the agencies are charged with the highest responsibility to protect tribal interests and further the nation-to-nation relationship with tribal nations. And there's a recognition in this agreement that the Bears Ears Commission and the federal agencies serve a role to work together for the planning, the management, the conservation, restoration, and protection of sacred lands within Bears Ears National Monument, as well as in the protection of ceremonies and rituals and traditional uses that are part of the tribal nation's way of life on these lands. And so in short, the question, what is co-management at Bears Ears National Monument? It is collaborative efforts between the agencies and the tribal nations to address tribal issues, to ensure that tribal priorities inform the management of Bears Ears National Monument. And so how is this different than consultation, government to government consultation that's happened in the past? I think in a lot of instances it's referred to as the agencies are just checking the box to say that they've consulted with tribal nations. And in a sense, some cases that may be a fair statement, but I think it's one of the challenges that we try to overcome with this cooperative agreement, and something that we can all work together on. And I think that'll probably be part of the conversation tonight. How do we get beyond this perception of checking the box? And I think, within the agencies, we have many, many dedicated staff, people who care about these landscapes and the resources and our responsibilities to tribal nations. And, our responsibilities as federal agencies under regulations and policies, and our responsibilities to tribal nations, we need to find ways to help each other to be able to accomplish this. And I think that's where we're going to go tonight as part of our conversation, to do better in that responsibility to engage early and meaningfully with tribal nations. And so I will kind of kick this conversation off and pass a question on to Angelo and to the rest of the panel to consider. And, at the Department of Interior, one of the priorities that's been talked about in some recent documents, some of our agency BLM guidance on working with tribal nations, it says that bolstering government to government relationships while acknowledging the past and working toward a better future for Indian country, that's one of the priorities for us as an agency and as a department within the federal government. And so my question for the rest of the panel to kind of consider and talk about right now is, at Bears Ears National Monument, what have you all seen the federal agencies and tribal nations do to begin to accomplish this goal? And what do you see? What are some things that we can do, on the agency side and on the tribal nation side? What can we do more to continue this forward progress of collaborative, cooperative management in Bears Ears National Monument and in other areas as well? So I'll pass that on to Angelo, and then we can continue that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's difficult because the transition from the last administration, which was so volatile and very open about not wanting to work with tribes and grassroots communities, feels like the turnover of people that we lost who were allies, who were real partners and working with us even before the designation of the monument, a lot of those folks kind of fell off and were either pushed out or they dropped out because it was too hard for them to maintain the goals that we have now that the federal agencies have put forth. So I sort of look at it as a more difficult conversation to have locally with the folks who are interacting with the federal agencies every day, because it's good and bad, the stories that they have. But it's harder to look at now and wonder still, given that we've just seen the direction that our country is going in with particular leadership, political affiliations, how much of that is true, how much people really do support good cooperative agreements, good collaborative management aspirations, real high ideals to manage a landscape together. I don't believe that's ever changed from the Indigenous people side. I think that's something that has always been part of our operating philosophy and continues to be. But I think it's harder to get a sense of what that really looks like in practice. And I think the recent, additions of the cooperative agreement, the Biden kind of announcements, and sort of the declarations of various folks in the agencies from the secretary on down, they indicate that there's possibilities that are positive and full of potential, and I think that's promising. But again, it's kind of hard to see what that really looks like on the ground yet, because we're trying really hard to figure out what does that look like. And I think that's an excellent question because I'm not really sure how substantive our attempts are yet, but I think that the activities, the effort, and the energy being placed into building those bridges, attempting to communicate across various divides and figuring out ways to do that in a cooperative fashion moves forward, not that quickly, not that greatly, but it's still moving forward. So I think that's why, you know, it's hard to gauge, but I think it's happening and it's possible, it's necessary, and it's hard work. And I think that's the number one thing to keep in mind, is that it's slow, laborious, patience-filled work. And it will be hard to see anything to point out and say for sure that is exactly what is happening in the right direction. But, you know, I'm looking forward to what we can accomplish in the next couple of years.
You know, and I want to kind of come at this in a way that during the early days when we were initially 5 tribes making the big ask, there was a lot of organization from a lot of the support groups, the conservation arena, and they were really reaching out into the communities. And since the designation, it just feels like a lot of us who are no longer sitting in those authority positions, like as a tribal leader, an elected tribal leader, we're just not feeling that outreach to the rest of the community members. So there's a lack of connection to even just the tribal communities, and to really gauge some of their traditional knowledge. It doesn't feel like that is there as much as it was during the time when we were doing a lot of community outreach. It just doesn't feel like we know where our place is in those conversations, because now the conversations have become very formal, and it's been definitely designated as collaborative management efforts in behalf of the agency and the commission, who are members of, you know, the elected officials from each of the 5 tribes, and then the rest of us really don't know where we fit. So a lot of that momentum has really subsided, and so now we're back at this level of, we did make great headway, but somehow it just kind of feels like we alienated those smaller voices again. And so, you know, a lot of people are not quite finding their position in the process. A lot of them don't know what a public hearing is and what that opportunity is. But during the whole organizational effort to acquire the statements during the public process, organizations helped people. They reached out to the older generations and to the people in general, and really helped them through that process. And it just doesn't feel like enough of us were able to grasp it, to continue the momentum of a lot of our local community members to be engaged in some of that. And so it feels like everything just shifted back over to the official level of tribal leadership engagement, more of a government to government. Maybe some agencies don't want to talk to us because we're not an elected official. So again, we kind of lost some footing to the regular Joe Schmo that's in the counties and in the tribal communities. And so some of the people don't feel like they're necessary anymore.
Yeah, I think, you know, Regina, I'd be curious to kind of dig into that a little bit more, on if you have some ideas on how to you know, maybe get back to some of that, or do a little bit better on the agency side, if you have some suggestions for us. I know we work really closely, almost, you know, at least weekly, with staff from the Bears Ears Commission, and working closely with members of the Bears Ears Commission and tribal nations, you know, at least every other week specifically. And so, you know, we have a lot of communication at that level. You know, we've strived to engage. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, we had you know, some youth from, you know, kind of an up and coming conservation crew that came out and helped us with a project in Arch Canyon within Bears Ears National Monument. So we had some youth engagement, and and other tribal members that came and participated in that from different tribes. Utilizing the Ancestral Lands Corps, which is made up of youth from many different tribal nations from across the Southwest region. And so, we're working and striving to participate and engage communities at that level and at many different levels within, actions within Bears Ears National Monument. But I'd be curious if you had some ideas or some suggestions on how we can all maybe improve on some of that, what you were trying to get at.
I think that I'm a little curious to even know from within the different communities really how some of the different outside impacts that are also influencing that feel of why people feel a little bit displaced from the conversation. I think that there's a lot more going on, both environmentally with many of the injustices, but also I think also what's impacting that conversation is just the outright political climate and environment. I think that really has a lot. And I think how we portray, from the agency level and even from organizations like the Great Old Broads, I think I think the challenge is really how do we all help to create that better environment that people feel welcomed. I think that that's really the challenge that's going to be on every one of the organizations. Oops, I'm sorry, my mic was on mute. So I just said, I think that it's going to be up to the organizations to create that environment, to be welcoming and to really help people feel like they can find their place back into that same sort of encouraging environment that makes you feel a part of the conversation.
Do you feel like, Regina, that's I think there's probably some things agencies can do, but is that also, the tribal nations and the leadership from the tribal side that needs to maybe do some of that outreach?
I think so. I think part of it is, and I hate to say it, I've said this many times, but I think no matter what level that we're at, I think sometimes we just need to get over ourselves and just realize that sometimes it's all about just having that thoughtful conversation that's in a little more relaxed environment rather than such an official capacity of where you're arriving at a place with a suit and tie and looking very governmental. And I'm just using that as an example, but I think that kind of has left a lot of people not being able to feel like they're necessary.
I'm happy to add some input into this conversation. When we got to kind of discussing some of the topics we wanted to cover as a group, this is something that our organization, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, as well as the Bears Ears Commission, gets a lot. And it's really kind of picking at the facet, almost the makeup of the commission itself. And so I think what I want to say is that, while we are making leaps and bounds at the Bears Ears National Monument, this is still a very early movement. What we're doing with the federal agencies with Jake it's still really new. And to the point that Angelo and both Regina made, this work it takes a long time. And I think because the folks who have been involved in this movement for decades now, I think that they get frustrated because it doesn't seem like things are moving fast enough. But I almost think that when we're doing the work day to day, that we do need to remind ourselves that it's hard. And when we're dealing with all of these I'll say more governmental structures. Work is slow, for us personally, when we think about bringing forth the directive from 5 different tribes, we have to make sure that all those individual tribes have the right necessary information, have the time to deliberate on that specific topic. And so, if we're talking about more tribal community engagement, we as the commission staff have to ensure that the engagement that we're doing has actually been signed off and approved by the 5 tribes, because we're representing those 5 different nations. And so I will say that from an operations and strategic side, I myself find kind of that frustration and not wanting to be more inclusive, or wanting to kind of advance the process faster than the tribes have the ability to contemplate. But I have to be reminded that part of tribal sovereignty is I don't get to necessarily have a say about that. And that's true of each individual of our tribes working with the other 4. And so there have been a number of times when, it's really critical for our tribes to have the time and space to really be deliberate about the actions that we make. And as a result of kind of that deliberate and I'll even say trust building, it takes a long time for us to decide what direction, what path, what decision we want to make. And, I think a lot about when we're having these really tough conversations internally, we always find ourselves coming back to that analogy of, we're stronger as a fist as opposed to 5 separate fingers. And so, you know, I think towards that, we do recognize that as an up and coming Bears Ears Commission, we do want to make tribal engagement more of a priority. And we're actually in the stages of trying to inform that priority. And so conversations like this, Regina and Angelo and even Jake, are really critical for us to hear as we begin really conceptualizing the aspirations, the expectations that we really want for this Bears Ears Commission. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for answering my question. I think Angelo's got a question next for us.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Let's see if I can find my question here. Okay, so here it is. Okay, my question for the panel would be, how can we rethink and redefine the concept of management, in quotes, to a relationship framing instead? Knowing that relationships have been difficult between the federal government and indigenous communities or nations, but also between the general public and tribal nations. And I think this is speaking more towards this idea of co-managing or collaborative managing, that, we go back to the sort of indigenous philosophy here that we don't really manage the land manages us. And how do we rethink that relationship in terms of putting it into actual land management practice? I think this is the sweet spot that we're looking for indigenous stewardship and Western ways of thinking about stewardship. So that's just my general question to you all.
And I think there's a lot to that question, Angelo, but thanks for the question. And for me, I am a land manager, and so in my brain it's kind of hard to separate out management from everything else, because it's kind of part of everything that we do. And even going back to your quote, like, we don't manage the land manages us. Like, there's still things going on that are being managed. And but I think relationships, you can't manage anything without those relationships, and good, productive, effective relationships. And so to me, it comes back to this idea that I was raised on, that nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so to me, that's one of my management philosophies, to where relationships is kind of key to that. it's not just relationships just to, say you have a relationship. It's how do you develop meaningful relationships that are genuine? You actually care about this and these people and the people that you're working with, whether that's, internally BLM folks. We also jointly manage this with the Forest Service. We have the Bears Ears Commission, which is made up of 5 tribal nations, with many players in that table as well as 27 other tribal nations that we're responsible to engage and consult with. It's not just the Bears Ears Commission. In total, there's 32 tribal nations that we consult with here as the Bureau of Land Management. And on top of that, there's many other interested stakeholder groups and just the general public. There's a lot of relationships and partnerships that are necessary to be able to manage effectively this cultural landscape that is Bears Ears National Monument. And so how do we build those genuine relationships? And part of it is just showing up. And so I think we as the Bureau of Land Management are doing everything we can. It's whenever the tribal nations can meet, and they throw out some dates, we'll rearrange our schedules and we make all of that work. We'll do whatever we can to be able to engage with the tribal nations as we strive to really figure what this co-management means here at Bears Ears National Monument, and what the proclamation's talking about, what the cooperative agreement's talking about, as far as our responsibility to really engage with tribal nations and integrate traditional knowledge into the decision making of everything that we do here within Bears Ears National Monument. And so that could look, there's funding needs for tribal nations to be able to accomplish some of this. And so being able to provide funding for different purposes as we engage with tribal nations, whether that's for tribal leaders or elders to come out to the landscape to provide feedback for us, or helping with some staffing issues within different tribal nations so that they have increased capacity to be able to engage on some of the things that are happening within the monument. Because in all honesty, a lot of these tribal nations are dealing with more than just Bears Ears National Monument and just our office. There's many government agencies from many different states that are sending letters and requests for consultation on different things. And so on a stack of papers on somebody's desk, how do we help pull that out and make it as easy as possible for staff and leaders within different tribal nations to engage. And so going back to that, it's nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so building those genuine relationships and making it as easy as possible for tribal nations and many of the other partners that we have outside of tribal nations as well. Like, how can we best work together to accomplish the mission of the presidential proclamations to protect this landscape for what it was designated for? I mean, it kind of, in a nutshell, that's my answer, but I mean, it's a really challenging process to be able to do that. I think Sharisa talked a little bit about that, the time that it takes to do some of these things and the time that it takes to build that trust. It's definitely a challenge, and we're striving to do that here at the BLM and Forest Service as we manage Bears Ears National Monument. But I don't know if Sharisa or Regina have anything to add there.
Sure. I was thinking about this one, and it always makes me wonder, how much leeway does the agency within putting together, like the management plans, do you really have any leeway in using a certain set of terminology? Because if we're really thinking about how we want to begin to make some of those shifts and began to go down, moving the needle from where we were without feeling like we're falling into the same movement that we've been in for centuries now. Is it being able to, instead of using words like management, finding the appropriate way of rephrasing things and like forming relationships, because relationships are not only just between the human beings, but the relationship is also between human beings and the landscape, human beings and the elements. So there's a relationship there, but there's also, that's also within that huge area of the space that we're talking about, which is a public land. You find us always talking about, you know, oil and gas and mineral leases and all of that, everything that's underground. So why is it so uncomfortable? I'm going to ask a question to answer a question. Why is it so uncomfortable to talk about the things that are popping up out of the surface of the ground and how we interact with that? And it's interesting how sometimes it's uncomfortable to hear the language that we've used over the generations, and really trying to shift and hear ourselves talk a little different in those manners. That just came really quickly to me as I'm doing the work in my current capacity. You know, in order for us to establish a relationship with the local tribal community here, we had to really pump the brakes and ask ourselves, what terms are we using that maybe might have many different definitions, maybe are not being understood by the same way that maybe we're using it, maybe it's being received in 20 other different ways. And so really thinking about how we talk and the terms that we use, is there a way that, you know, we can begin to really shape and massage out something that maybe that people would receive differently, and it wouldn't be so governmental. And I'm going to use one word that people always have different feelings, and that's the term tribe. You know, it's a very governmental identifier, but each of the indigenous groups, that was not a choice that we would be identified as being called tribes. So it's the terms. And so I often wonder, is this someplace that, you know, we could begin to think about things? But I'm also going to put that on organizations like the Great Old Broads and other groups that are out there, the nonprofits and the conservation groups. How are you talking about, you know, management versus relationship? How are you carrying on that conversation within the same context and expecting a different outcome? I think that that's really how we begin to make change, is really examining how and listening to how we talk ourselves, if that makes any sense.
You know, Angela, when I was reflecting on this question and kind of exactly to Regina's point just now, you know, so much of the current planning process that the commission is participating in with the agencies, I consider to be almost educational, emotional labor. And you know, I say that with like the kindest heart, Jake. You know, when we enter these spaces, it seems like we're speaking different languages, and so while some of the terms that we may use, you know, don't necessarily line up exactly with like quote management or these really like hard lines federal management terms, right? I think largely what I have seen our group be pretty successful at is being graceful and really extending, you know, their hand and helping our federal counterparts start to better understand, you know, some of these terms that we use. And you know, a lot of our tribes may have different words for different things, and so even kind of bridging that gap. But you know, I think to Regina's point, you know, I wanted to say we do heavily rely on our external partners to really help us lift that educational kind of burden, because it's a lot for us to go into these spaces and to continually you know, try and educate, and it doesn't seem like we're getting anywhere. And then, you know, we kind of come back internally and we're like, well, I thought we had already communicated that, or something that we see is kind of it doesn't quite get interpreted as we had intended it to. And so, I will say, like, during this like educational process of back and forth, we've been really kind to each other to say, okay, let's pause the brakes and, let's really try to get at the root of what we are trying to say here. And yeah, I guess, I'm really grateful that we have enough trust that we've already established in our short amount of time and working with each other since the cooperative agreement has signed, that we're able to really to give each other grace and say, okay, let's pause and let's really try to understand what we're attempting to say to each other.
Yeah, I really appreciate that insight, Teresa. And I think it really highlights kind of the two-way street that co-management really is, as we strive to figure out what this means and what this looks like at a place like Bears Ears National Monument. And we have a lot of meetings with the Bears Ears Commission and their staff. And I don't know if this shows up, but I carry this the land management plan with me almost everywhere I go, as I work on with staff and the Bears Ears Commission as we develop a new management plan for Bears Ears. And in there, it highlights some of these different philosophies and what different things mean. And so I think as an agency, we're learning from tribal nations and their leaders, some of the different concepts, like different ways of looking at management on the ground, and incorporating that into the new management plan for Bears Ears National Monument. And I think it's, when I'd say a two-way street, there's also BLM and the Forest Service, we have regulations and different things that we have to follow. Like, we can't just kind of set those aside. And so that's part of this education as well at a lot of these meetings that we have, is helping everyone also understand what the regulations and our policies are as we develop management plans or have on the ground actions that we need to manage for. And so I think we're in this world of kind of learning together of how do we do what we as federal agencies have to do per regulation, but at the same breath incorporating these traditional philosophies and insights that are being shared with us as we strive to develop a new management plan or do on the ground management at Bears Ears National Monument.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and go into my question for the conversation. So in a world full of inequities, how can we move forward towards more collaborative solution-based conversations, within our management planning and all of that within public process? I think that there's, like I mentioned a little earlier, there's a lot of environmental inequities and injustices that are located nearby, and there is so much out there that in terms of our political environment that really leave us a little bit curious if there is any creative solutions, and to what degree are we willing to address these, or even start talking about it without it feeling so uncomfortable. Anybody?
I'll take a little bit of a roll at it. I think your question is really important right now, because every organization worth their salt is reevaluating themselves in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think they're reevaluating themselves in every nonprofit, conservation org, even federal agencies. People are required to take these trainings and understand what that means, both legally and in practice. But that doesn't stop us from doing more and from doing better. And so I really believe that, the possibilities of having that kind of inclusivity and the the weight and consideration of what impacts that are upon the public or upon the communities, especially that are right there in these lands that we're talking about, mean to them. I think that's a huge deal because we're really looking at, especially now, in a global context, climate change. We're looking at, a divisive political climate. We're also looking at the possibilities of, drought and economic disruption, pandemics. So everything is connected to everything else. And so we can't really think of these things as like separate siloed categories anymore. And I feel like that is the tendency that people want to default into in these massive organizations. And so they kind of like just go towards that training, the conditioning that we've always known. And more those boundaries and walls have to be broken down, and they're eroding now anyway. So the more that we kind of think of these in terms of interconnectivity and the impact that we have on each other, I think the better off everyone else is going to be. I mean, I always use the example of looking at San Juan County itself, and the water that's in the reservoir is the lowest it's ever been, and that's just right outside of Bears Ears National Monument, but nobody talks about that. The fact is the watershed is shared there with the mountains and the same areas where the water is being impacted, as well as, mining or milling or whatever it is that's going on there for natural resource extraction. And everybody just looks at the map and just says, well, we only deal with this area. It doesn't concern us, but it absolutely does, because water doesn't care about maps. It doesn't care about boundaries, and it's for everyone. And so everyone should be concerned. So I really think that's one of the things that we have to do in terms of these solution-based conversations, is focus on how are we looking across those traditionally siloed areas, and how can we do better at including them together in these conversations.
And I appreciate that. I think I've often said it in many different places where I think we're so good at siloing out conversations and how things don't impact the next. But if there's one thing that our tribal elders and ancestors have taught us, everything's connected to something else. We're all connected to one another, and we all need each other. We need what's within our Mother Earth. And I think that that's something that within conversations like this, I think that breaking down those barriers to that uncomfortable conversation is really a little bit of the forefront of engaging what redefining management and relationships are, engaging with what it is that agency culture is about, and talking about them, because one does impact the other, as well as what roles do the conservation and the nonprofits, the NGOs, what roles do you play in all of this? And I think we all have a piece of the puzzle, hence we all have some responsibility and accountability to bringing those creative conversations and solutions to the table.
I'm wondering if we jump to Sharice's question, since we're kind of running low on time.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. Yeah, we can do that. So, my question for the group is, understanding that Bears Ears Commission is a novel pursuit, in what ways can we expand upon future collaborative management so that other tribal nations and communities can realize full co-management of their ancestral homelands?
I can take a first shot at this one. I think, I was thinking about, similar to this question, we had the Pueblo of Acoma out in the Bears Ears landscape. We had a field trip with them just last week. Had some good conversations and discussions out in the field. And, one of the thoughts that I had and was discussed and has been discussed since is this idea that, many of these tribal elders and leaders, they've had a lifetime of experience and knowledge that's been passed on from generation to generation for a long time. And that is just something that we as federal agencies, we will never be able to fully understand many of those concepts and that understanding that tribal elders and leaders bring to the table of land management, and that needs to be incorporated into the management of a place like Bears Ears National Monument. And I think that is one spot where it's one of the challenges for us to really engage with tribal nations and incorporate that traditional knowledge, is because we don't have a lot of that traditional understanding and knowledge, and we rely on tribal nations and the elders and the leaders to be able to provide that to us. I think for us to really be able to manage this landscape collaboratively with tribal nations, as appropriate and when needed, there may be instances where it's appropriate for certain things, to be shared with federal land managers, if it's something that will help us better manage and protect, different things, if it's, ceremonial sites, sacred sites, traditional uses that are happening in certain areas. There could be some instances where it may be appropriate to share as kind of co-managers, co-stewards of a landscape, so that we can help better manage and protect that landscape hand in hand with tribal nations. And I think that's one of the steps that we've been exploring here at Bears Ears National Monument, is what's appropriate, where and what can be shared, and even things as simple as confidentiality of what is confidential in our deliberations amongst each other, to be able to best manage this landscape together.
I think one of the areas, if we're going to ensure the future, I'm going to just constantly harp on this one. And if that's something that we truly want to invest in, then we've got to start with our young people. We've got to bring them in on the knowledge. We've got to bring them in on knowledge of process, constantly sharing with them the story and the journey. If they don't know where they've come from, then how will they know where they need to go? So I believe that a lot of this really also is something to keep an eye on. I completely get it that the elders are immensely informed, and they have their life processes that they've had in their experiences. But we've always got to remember it. The young people will become adults. The adults will become the elders eventually. They will become the knowledge keepers. And we've got to remember that there's a process in that. In order to ensure the future, we need to make sure that the young people are knowledgeable of every aspect of this, so that we can look forward to knowing that our grandchildren will have the same opportunities that we had.
I like that, Regina. Yeah, and the BLM locally, we've actually funded many programs. For example, we have an agreement with the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, where we're providing funding for leaders and elders to take their youth out on trips, so that they can kind of share some of that knowledge with the next generation. So I think you're right on there, Regina. Thanks for sharing.
Hi, Angela, do you want to respond before we do the Q&A?
We can jump right into the Q&A. I think we're running out of time.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this very, very deep and rich conversation. We are blessed. So my first question is for Teresa. And what are some of the, so we're going to be taking audience questions at this point, just to be clear. So for Teresa, what are some of the specific actions tribes hope to accomplish within Bears Ears and the partnership with federal agencies?
Yeah, thank you, Sally and the audience. So I think the first thing that really comes to mind is helping the federal agencies really understand that, you know, when we look at a landscape, it's not something that is meant to be divided, but rather it's something that we as Indigenous people consider to be interconnected. There's really no kind of distinction from one so-called cultural resource to a next. And so part of the education that I was really speaking to earlier is really ensuring that, you know, when we're looking at different aspects of the landscape, that we're really underlining the management recommendations from the lens of a cultural perspective, and understanding that even an individual, you know, we can say site or specific other, you know, I'm thinking about like paleontological resource, you know, those two things may be considered separate, but something that we really try to educate and underscore is that even the space between those two sites, you know, actually has value and holds knowledge. And so kind of one of the really concrete things that we're looking to do is to really just kind of start expanding the way in which the term management is actually perceived in the agency perspective. And I'm feeling pretty confident that we're making headway on that. And then in terms of some greater priorities outside of the agency planning process is really understanding that, you know, the Bears Ears Commission is a new pursuit, and that, you know, it's going to take us extra time, additional resources, support in order to help the tribes fully realize their vision, and understanding that, you know, this is an opportunity for all of Indian country to really start paving a pathway for other Indigenous nations to be able to have more autonomy, more decision-making over their ancestral homelands, most of which have been removed. And so just continuing to support and uplift tribal perspectives, you know, not only specific to the Bears Ears, but other tribal communities, Indigenous nations that are hoping to really advance and further their tribal autonomy, so that they're starting to get more agency over their actions, so that we can, you know, collectively better our tribal communities. I think we all recognize that when our communities are happy, healthy, safe, we all function better as a society. So I think that would be my specific answer to that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. So the next question, and this is open to all, how can Great Old Broads and Bros engage with government-to-government cooperative management practices as a nonprofit organization and as elders?
I mean, from a federal perspective, you know, appreciate the partnership, especially with the Bears Ears Commission, but also, you know, other organizations that play a critical role in the management of these lands, and, you know, whether that's the development of a resource management plan, or, you know, different things that are happening on the ground to ensure that we're managing appropriately under the guidance of the presidential proclamation and incorporating traditional knowledge. Just encourage, you know, everybody to participate and engage in the public processes of whatever we're doing, and helping us, you know, to see new or different avenues with the expertise of many of you all in these organizations and in the general public. So from my perspective, that would be my answer there.
Thank you, Jake. Anyone else?
I think making sure that you can support, maybe come from a more supportive position with the tribes, either as an organization, or if, you know, it happens to be in line with maybe something else that's within Colorado or in Utah that's more specific. I think supporting the tribe that is engaging and allowing for them to continue that conversation as it is a government to government, as sometimes often gets referred to, specifically if it's from the Great Old Broads. I think that that's the best way you can help, is be supportive of the tribe themselves.
Thank you so much. Angela, do you have anything to add?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'll add that, you know, it's remarkable how much there is a potential for many good, positive futures, just in the imagining of what Bears Ears could be. So thinking about what other future collaborative projects with tribes and different agencies might be, are also open to the imagination. And I think that's really important here, that people use their imagination, that they think outside of the box, that they think innovatively and creatively, and they try to find different ways to make these things work, because the Bears Ears model isn't like a one size fits all. It shouldn't be replicated in every situation. It has to be unique to the people and the place and the geography and the plants and the animals and the different considerations that go into each of those. And I think that's part of the work that you have to do in a considerate and patient way. And also recognize that we also don't have all the time in the world. So we're having to do both and that, you know, these kinds of projects are really important, but they're not going to be perfect, and that's fine, because this is the business of human beings. We rarely are, but we're doing our best to make sure that our other than human relatives are also being well taken care of. And I think that's a key shift in the way that we perceive and continue to do this work in the future. And that takes everyone. So just the importance of like really thinking creatively about how to do that.
Thank you, Angelo. And our next question, as we speak about relationships, it seems that agency personnel also need to consider the reciprocal relationships with the landscape, which is much more common among Indigenous partners. Reciprocal relationships with the lands and waters and species are sometimes missing from agency perspectives. Would someone speak to the importance of this concept?
Sally, just really briefly, I need to step out and run, but I just wanted to thank everyone for their time this evening and conversation and input. Grateful to share this space with you, and I hope that you all have a great evening, and hope that you're all blessed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, Sally, thanks for the question. I'm not sure who asked the question, but you know, I think this kind of ties into a lot of the conversation that Sharisa was bringing to the dialogue tonight. And you know, that the Bears Ears Commission is working closely with us, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, as we develop a management plan and work on, you know, working together as we manage the Bears Ears landscape. And so I think you know, understanding, you know, these tribal perspectives and philosophies of how the landscape is interconnected, and considering a more holistic approach in terms of management of this landscape, I think is kind of at the forefront of our minds as we're, you know, developing a management plan, which is kind of the number one priority right now for the agencies is getting that management plan developed hand in hand with the tribal nations and the Bears Ears Commission. And so I think, concepts like this from the question it's really kind of at the forefront of our minds as we're striving to develop a management plan that could look nothing like, your traditional, agency resource management plans, trying to incorporate these concepts from traditional knowledge that aren't typically seen in resource management plans. And so, kind of in short, that would be, my response there is that, we are striving to open our minds and to understand concepts that we maybe historically haven't taken the time to fully grasp and incorporate into our management of this landscape. So.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in? Okay, great. Okay, this is going to be our last question. We have a lot of questions, but we all have very short time. So our last question is, this is all new and if successful, it may become a model for further cooperative agreements with tribes. What can those who have input in the decisions do to make sure it serves that purpose genuinely?
So first off, I want to say, yes, it is new. And it's not a matter of if, because I think we're already in the motions of completing and following through some of that. And so I think to ensure that it's cooperatively done, I think that, and I feel very strongly that many of us are being mindful of it. One of the things that with the previous experience of serving as an elected official, I accepted a position to serve on the management advisory committee for the monument. And so when we think about how things can look and which way they can go, I think many of us are very, very invested in making sure that it continues to move in that equitable way.
I think I really already kind of spoke to this in terms of future possibilities with other tribes and other agreements. I think, being creative and innovative about that is part of it, adapting towards the needs of specific tribes and in various areas. But I also think that, it's quite common to have the sort of, again, defaulting to whatever conditioning or training that you may have is to rethink all of that conditioning and training that you may have and understand that you could ask for more in different ways. And when I say more, it's not in terms of gains or, thinking about it in acreage or in political power or whatever quantifiable weird way that a lot of Western folks like to think of it. I think of it more as reciprocity, having an exchange in a relationship, that the gains are really long-term. And in fact, if we're doing things right, we're really not going to see those gains in our lifetime. They're going to be coming on down the line. And just the fact that we can walk into these spaces as intact and as protected as they can possibly be, as close as we can as when our ancestors saw them, I think is the success. That's a huge success. And people sometimes don't think of it that way. They're kind of thinking of it of like accomplishments or designations or acreage or whatever. But, I think it's a reworking of, how do we perceive these things to be successful future collaborative management projects? I think that's an excellent question. And really thinking about, to the end of that question, how to serve that purpose genuinely, because that's going to take work as well. You'll always have to come back to the beginning of, why are we doing this work? Why does it matter? And to me, if folks are trying to be at the table to talk about land management, but they don't care about the land or they don't care about the people. What are you doing there? Like, to me, it's like, let's not waste time or energy. We have to think about what this means, because it's beyond ourselves. This responsibility is huge, and the burden of it is not light. And so it's going to take everyone to do the work together. And so that's what I think about that, because there's endless possibilities and things that we haven't even considered about how we could do this in the future, it's very exciting.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, Sally, just really quick, I guess I'll just add to the last question there that it is new, and it's a unique opportunity for all of us to engage and work with one another as we develop a process and a program and a system that potentially is never really been done at this level before. Especially you got 2 federal agencies and really 32 tribal nations, but technically you have the 5 of the Bears Ears Commission. So how do we develop a program and a system and a process of working together that outlives any land manager or tribal leaders? Managers come and go, tribal leaders, there's elections and there's new people every once in a while. In an environment of constant change, how do we develop a system and a program that will function and outlive all of us who are participating at this stage? And I think it all boils down to those relationships and to that caring and finding the solutions and building something now that will outlast and outlive all of us as a framework and a system and a process to truly engage with tribal nations and communities and incorporate that understanding into the way that federal agencies are managing Bears Ears National Monument, reflecting that traditional knowledge and understanding and uses of this landscape. And so I think that's the real task ahead of us, is building something that will outlast and outlive us all in a way that respects this cultural landscape for what it was designated for the purposes of that.
Thank you, Jake. And thank you, Regina, and thank you, Angelo. We are now going to conclude our questions and answers, but first I wanted to really thank the participants who submitted very thoughtful questions, and apologies that we could not get to them all. And right now I'm going to pass it off to Sarah, who's going to close our webinar. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again to our great panelists. We really appreciate you all taking time out of your schedule to have this really important conversation. It was unique. We have not done something like this before with Broads, and I really personally enjoyed letting you all steer the conversation and just really have open and honest dialogue. I think that's what's really important, no matter who we are in this conservation movement and wanting to protect these very important lands, is let's have a conversation. And so once again, I just want to thank Jake, Regina, Angelo, and Teresa. Also, I want to thank all of our participants tonight. We have had a great variety of people from all around the country, so thank you for joining us. And then also, I want to say thank you to all of our broadband leaders and members, our staff here in Durango, all of our volunteers, and then a special shout out to our grassroots leadership team of Lisa, Katya, and Sally for helping put this on. Thank you so much for having a great event. We look forward to having more conversations in the future with you all, so keep an eye out for future events with Great Old Broads for Wilderness, and we will see you again soon.